The Minoan civilization of Bronze Age Crete is world famous for the enormous building complexes we know as palaces and for its exquisite art, expressed in lovely pottery, figurines and in frescoes of the most exquisite beauty. The Minoans were also great seafarers. Their ships reached across the Mediterranean to engage in trade with the civilizations of the Near East, importing exotic luxuries like date palms and pomegranates, and exporting wine and saffron. Talented Minoan artists even found work in foreign courts, for instance painting frescoes at Avaris in Egypt. Their artwork is famous for its depiction of beautiful women wearing lavish clothing and jewellery, of ritual processions and other exciting ceremonies. These luxurious, sophisticated scenes, along with the apparent lack of high walls around settlements, led many to believe that the Minoan civilization was a remarkably peaceful society. However, is this narrative, this perception of a peaceful Bronze Age Crete, actually true? Considering the fact that violent conflict is a feature of all societies around the world, past and present, is it even plausible that a wealthy civilization could develop or be maintained without the widespread threat and use of force? But what does the evidence tell us? Are there any signs of fortifications in Bronze Age Crete? Is there any Minoan artwork showing weapons and warriors? Can we tell anything from injuries on skeletons? And what about all those Minoan daggers, swords, spears and axes in the archaeological record? This is the story of weaponry and warfare in Minoan Crete. You know, I get hundreds of comments on my channel every month. I'm grateful for all of them, by the way, and I'm always surprised by how often people say my videos help them to relax and take a break from the stresses of their lives. It seems quite a few of you even put these videos on to fall asleep to. No judgment, by the way, but if you're feeling stressed, if you're dealing with anxiety, or if you're facing other personal challenges or mental health issues, then maybe talking to someone about these problems could really help. I have therapists in my family and I know the value of the support that professionals can provide to people who need it. And that's why this video is in paid partnership with BetterHelp. BetterHelp connects you with a credentialed therapist who is trained to listen and to give you helpful, unbiased advice. How it works is, first you go to their site and please use my link betterhelp.com/Dan Davis and answer a few questions. Then BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. You can do it all from your phone or computer via phone call, video chat or messaging, however you feel most comfortable. This is the easiest possible way to start talking to a therapist, and you'll be matched to a therapist usually within 48 hours so you can get started fast. If this is something you think could help you with the challenges you're facing, please visit betterhelp.com/Dan Davis or choose Dan Davis History during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. Thank you to BetterHelp for partnering with me on this video. So who were the Minoans? Where did they come from? Well, the island of Crete was populated during the Neolithic after about 7000 BC. Analysis of ancient DNA from human remains shows that the farmers living here originally came from nearby Anatolia, and they continued to grow crops and graze animals here for thousands of years. The Neolithic people lived in open villages on the fertile lowlands, and they gradually, over millennia, grew in technological sophistication. Now, there is a history of fortified settlements in the Aegean going back to the early Neolithic. Most famously perhaps the sites of Sesklo and Dimini in Thessaly on the Greek mainland. These two sites, rather close to one another, were defended by impressive stone walls and baffle gates meant to slow and funnel attackers. And there's evidence from Neolithic Greece that shows violence was inflicted on people. For example, at one site alone in southern Greece, an analysis of 161 bodies showed that 13% had suffered depressed skull fractures, indicating that they'd been smashed in their head with clubs or maybe whacked by sling bullets of stone or baked clay. But what does all this have to do with violence in Bronze Age Crete? Well, this is just to establish the fact that the Neolithic Aegean was a violent place with violent people. What we call the Minoan civilization developed out of the earlier Neolithic population living on Crete, along with an additional late Neolithic migration from Anatolia. The people of the Bronze Age Aegean had a history of violence going back thousands of years, and no one claims that neighbouring Bronze Age societies in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia and Syria were peaceful either. So how did the popular notion of peaceful Minoans ever come about in the first place? Well, it was largely due to the British archaeologist Arthur Evans, who excavated for years on Crete from 1900, uncovering the so-called Palace at Knossos, naming the Minoan Civilization after the legendary king Minos, and defining it as something distinct from the Mycenaeans on the mainland. Over a century of academic work has been carried out since then, and many of Evans's interpretations have been challenged and overturned. However, the initial framing by Evans of the Minoans as peaceful, flower-loving artists has prevailed, at least in the public consciousness, and it's not hard to see why. The initial excavations were focused on Knossos, and the artifacts, and especially the frescoes there, portray flowers, animals, and beautiful, sexy women, rather than warrior kings. The author Rodney Castleton sums up the traditional view in his 1990 book on the Minoans, quote, "This firmly established 20th century tradition has it that the Minoans were talented, subtle, luxury-loving, worldly, sophisticated. They were sensitive, elegant, and graceful. They loved refined and sumptuous decor, beautiful art objects and jewellery. They loved peace and the rule of law, detesting tyranny and warfare. They had no personal ambition, a trait inferred from the complete anonymity of artists, sculptors, rulers and military leaders. There were no boastful lists of great achievements or conquests, and no monumental portrait statues of kings of the type found in Egypt." And he goes on, "One of their most outstanding traits, the tradition has it, was their love of peace, the Pax Minoica, spreading effortlessly as a result of pure and massive cultural superiority across the Aegean Sea. The Minoans' strength at sea was so great that they had no need to fortify their Cretan cities at all. None of them had defensive walls." End quote. We'll come back to the artistic tradition shortly, but first let's consider that central argument to the peaceful Minoans tradition, the apparent lack of fortifications surrounding palaces and settlements. The traditional view for Crete is that the lack of walls around Minoan sites means they had no fear of being attacked and therefore lived in a peaceful society. But the trouble with this line of reasoning is that it's just not true. Starting in the early Minoan period, about 2650 to 2200 BC, many sites were established in highland areas, their locations probably chosen with defence in mind. Because Crete is a very rugged landscape, the topography itself formed natural defensive units that were exploited by the careful siting of settlements. And there are known fortified sites too. There's a Middle Minoan era hilltop site dating to around 2000 to 1800 BC that overlooks the north coast of Crete with a substantial circular defensive wall. There's another similar mini-fortress settlement to the west along the coast, just about visible from it in fact. And it's possible that these two were part of a chain of coastal forts. In fact, one argument for the supposedly peaceful nature of Minoan Crete is that the island was defended most of all by sea. The sea itself was a barrier that protected it from attack. The Minoans were great sailors, and their ships would have likely been manned by men who would have had to defend themselves from attack at sea and in foreign lands. For much of history generally, there was often a fine line between trading and piracy, and voyages could turn from one form to the other when necessary. The classical Greeks remembered the ancient Cretans as a thalassocracy, their power coming from ruling the seas. Clearly, the existence of coastal fortresses suggests this domination of Mediterranean trade also required the use of force. But of course, people had been crossing the Aegean for thousands of years, and enemy landings would have been repulsed on land. The topography of Crete itself meant that there were limited avenues to move armies, especially if chariots and wagons were also used for transport and warfare. And control of these routes led to the Minoans establishing guardhouses along the Bronze Age roads. Dating from about 1800 to 1400 BC, there are about 169 known guardhouses, or guard stations, that shows the elites controlled the movement of people and goods through the landscape. and these guardhouses would have presumably been manned by soldiers, guards who had the authority to use force as part of their job. So we know there were special buildings with at least a partial military function. And as for the settlements themselves, some academics have argued that archaeological excavations on Crete have only rarely looked at the perimeters of major urban centres. If more excavations were done on the outskirts, perhaps more defensive structures would be found. Even so, archaeologist Stella Chrysoulaki lists multiple Minoan settlements with probable defensive works, with fortification walls and towers, including at Knossos and Malea. Throughout its long existence, the Minoan civilization went through various phases of stability and disorder, reflected in the settlements that were successively established, destroyed, rebuilt, abandoned, and so on at various times through the centuries. All this activity might indicate competition and conflict between elites, as groups expanded, conquered others, and were conquered or collapsed in turn. Destruction at sites in Crete was frequently followed by abandonment, which could be evidence of massacres or entire populations being enslaved by conquerors. Many destruction layers are also characterized by extensive fires. At the beautiful site of Moklos, now a tiny island just off the coast of Crete, excavations uncovered masses of charred human remains in a late Minoan house, interpreted as the remains of those killed during a sack of the settlement. It's clear that the archaeology of settlements in Bronze Age Crete does in fact suggest the elite used force to protect themselves and, at times, to wage destructive wars on each other. But if war was part of Minoan life, why did they not show it in their artwork? Women were more commonly featured in Minoan art. But men were also depicted, carrying out a range of activities such as hunting, boxing, bull leaping, marching, processions, archery, and posing with weapons. These are presumably depictions of elite Minoan males engaging in the activities that helped to define them as a class. Hunting and sports are of course typical aristocratic pursuits that are great fun in and of themselves, but also serve as excellent training for war. While many weapons can serve as tools for hunting rather than war, the men wearing the famous boar's tusk helmets and holding large shields can only be interpreted as soldiers. Although I should say that these are often said to be scenes of rituals or processions rather than battle itself, but the presence of warriors rather suggests the existence of warfare. But the relative lack of battle scenes doesn't necessarily mean war was a rarity too. Minoan artistic expressions had various cultural purposes, and frescoes just might not have been considered the right medium for depicting violence. As Charles Gates points out in his 1999 article, "Why are there no scenes of warfare in Minoan art?" Quote, "There is no correlation between the practice of warfare and the choice of warfare as a pictorial theme." End quote. There are a few random fragments from Knossos of men throwing spears or running with them. One of these reassembled fragmentary scenes was named the Captain of the Blacks by Arthur Evans, who interpreted it as an image of a Minoan officer leading an imaginary troop of African subordinates. It would be easy to mock Evans for imposing his early 20th century British imperialist interpretation onto this fragment, but we should remember that despite their best efforts, every generation of archaeologists inevitably does the same kind of thing. Martial imagery appears more commonly in the form of seal stones or seal rings. These items were worn, and so were ornamental as well as functional objects that reflected the worldview of their owners more than did the frescoes. Many seals feature men holding spears or marching with them, but some feature men fighting with daggers or swords and shields. There are also many hunting scenes depicted, again reinforcing the link between the aristocratic pursuits of hunting and warfare. Then there's images on stone vessels, like the Chieftain Cup from Aegean Triada, featuring two men armed with a spear and a sword. There's been much debate over the meanings of the scene being depicted, but its martial nature is obvious. And these are clearly well-muscled and well-groomed and ornamented elite warriors. There's also the Boxer Raiton, also from Aegean Triada, depicting muscled men boxing and bull leaping. The fact that some of the boxing men are wearing helmets reinforces the idea of sports as training for warfare. Bull leaping is seen as primarily a ritual activity, but clearly it was also an appropriate, dangerous, vigorous physical activity for elite men, along with boxing, hunting, and warfare. Further links can be drawn between ritual or religious activity and warfare in Minoan society by looking at sacred sites. They used sacred caves and what are called peak sanctuaries, as in mountain peaks, to carry out rites that often involved leaving votive offerings. These offerings could include clay figurines of people and animals, but they also left miniature weapons at the peak sanctuaries and model weapons that were made to be offerings, and actual functional weapons were also left at cave sites. These real or model swords, spears and axes, and small clay figures of armed warriors were symbolic offerings relating to warfare. Perhaps warriors made offerings before combat to get right with the gods, or gave thanks for victory after successful battles. We can assume there was a god or gods of warfare, and perhaps a smith god for metal workers specialising in weapon manufacturing. Throughout Bronze Age Europe, we find weapons primarily as grave goods in burials and also in bronze hoards, when weapons and other metal artefacts are buried in the ground or placed into rivers or bogs as offerings. In Bronze Age Crete, however, for much of their history, the Minoans didn't have a tradition of spectacular, chiefly burials that we see in other places, or of burying large bronze hoards. It doesn't mean there were no powerful warrior lords in life, just that this wasn't expressed with extravagant warrior tombs in death. Perhaps they believed in a peaceful, idyllic afterlife where men could finally be free from war. Maybe the tools of war were passed down from father to son, or the valuable bronze items were returned to the collective ownership of the elite-controlled armories for continued use. Human remains from Bronze Age Crete do sometimes display trauma inflicted by weapons. The bones of men and women show damage from swords, spears, axes, arrowheads, and possibly sling stones. Of course, injuries like this could be from murders or executions too, but considering everything else we know, it's likely many wounds were suffered in war. And there are in fact so-called warrior burials from later Bronze Age Crete, where individuals were buried with daggers, axes, and/or spears. As these post-date the probable Mycenaean conquest of Crete, these have long been interpreted as the graves of Mycenaean conquerors or mercenaries, but it's just as likely they were Cretans embracing new concepts of burial. The supposed relationships between Mycenaeans and Minoans has helped form the dominant perceptions of both societies. It was imagined that the warlike Mycenaeans started out being employed as mercenaries by the peace-loving merchant Minoans, only for the Mycenaeans to eventually turn on their former masters to conquer and rule over Crete from about 1450 BC. Of course, there is truth to this narrative, and Mycenaeans did conquer Crete, at least it seems that way to me, but the martial influences did not only go one way. In fact, it was the Minoans who were at the forefront of military technology. Over 80% of bronze objects from early Bronze Age Crete are weapons, and 73% of all known early and Middle Bronze Age Aegean daggers come from Crete. Sword technology seems to have spread from Crete to the mainland, and then to the workshops of the Bronze Age Carpathians in Central Europe, where sword technology underwent further independent development for centuries, until it was perfected and spread back to the Aegean. The early Minoan period saw the gradual development of metal daggers, the weapons growing longer and more robust over time, until there's little doubt they were used entirely as specialist combat weapons. However, it could be argued, in fact it is often argued, that daggers were primarily general-purpose tools and hunting weapons. However, when Minoans developed their first swords by around 1800 BC, there can be no doubt that they were tools for combat only. The earliest form, known as Type A, was possibly inspired by those in the Near East and Cyprus, but it might also have been an independent design. After all, once you've developed long daggers, it's not much of a conceptual jump to sword length. However, it required advanced metalworking skills to manufacture functional long blades. and the Minoan workshops continued to develop and improve their sword designs for centuries, making them increasingly effective. Different sword designs reflect different fighting styles. You can imagine the basic idea just from looking at them. Long pointy ones were made for thrusting, while broader blades were better for slashing. There's far more complexity in practice, of course, and designs evolved to meet changing martial practices and defensive technologies. Boar's tusk helmets were developed by Minoans and feature in their artwork. These were made by sewing boar tusk plates, made by cutting flat sections from boar tusks onto a leather backing. They were effective as armour, and perhaps had symbolic purposes too, calling on the strength and ferocity of the wild boar itself, and that dangerous aristocratic pursuit, the boar hunt. Minoan warriors also employed large body shields, rectangular or figure 8 shaped, from at least 1800 BC or so, right through to around 1200 BC. These were made from a wicker frame and tough rawhide, perhaps also holding symbolic value, considering the popularity of bull imagery in Minoan art and the pastime of bull leaping. They also developed body armour, possibly made from metal plates like the Mycenaean dendra panoply, although it's not clear how widespread it was, nor if they used leather armour too. But considering the metallurgical skill of the Minoan workshops and the wealth of the island, which by all accounts was greater than on the mainland, I think it's likely Minoan metal armour was employed in battle. You can see in artwork that spears were important military weapons, and although the early ones were rather simple and could have been hunting weapons, later heavier spears had complex designs. It's rather likely, judging by their mass and geometry, that some were designed for punching through armour. Now, one of the most famous icons of Minoan Crete is the double axe, sometimes called the labris. You will see this described almost everywhere as a purely symbolic object, associated only with rituals that had nothing to do with warfare, and many examples are indeed miniature versions or overly large ones made from sheet metal. But as we've seen, Minoans made model versions of all their real functional weapons, and in fact the majority of double axes known are the functional cast copper and bronze forms. Some of these are inscribed with the martial symbols of boar tusk helmets and figure 8 shields. So it's likely that Minoan warriors fought with double axes, probably in close quarter fighting, and they used them just like axes from later periods were used, for reaching over shields to strike the head, and for hooking the top of the shields to pull them down, to break up shield formations, and to create an opening for a neighbouring comrade to strike with a sword, spear or bow and arrow. Contemporary Mycenaean images of battle show this kind of combined arms fighting, with archers fighting amongst shielded spearmen, for example. The Minoan weaponry workshops continued to produce weapons after the Mycenaean conquest. In fact, Mycenaean Linear B tablets from Knossos list numbers of swords and spears, as well as men who likely served as guards and others who were foreign mercenaries. Towards the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BC or so, new expressions of warriorhood developed, influenced by Central Europe and mainland Greece, that saw smaller shields and the now 2-type sword spreading to Crete. However, local versions of these foreign origin swords were made by the ancient local workshops, adapted to local fighting styles. But the population decline on the island and the wider regional changes we call the Late Bronze Age collapse led to the end of the Minoan era by about 1000 BC. Most of the information for this video comes from 2 articles on the subject by Barry Molloy, and from the sources he lists in his articles. As with all my videos, the sources can be found in the description if you'd like to know more and to read about it from actual experts instead of me. Late Minoan warrior burials also featured the entire warrior package of weapons, jewellery, mirrors, tweezers and razors, as I describe in detail on my video on Bronze Age warrior beauty, so please watch that video now or check out my Bronze Age warfare playlist. Thank you for watching.